What a massively depressing opening segment that was. I mean, come on, Purple Nation, you have to be devastated watching this show. Not only was last week's game so terrible, but our flag falling down, Jeff sitting in the shadows, the lighting just abysmal on the set. We've got to crank it up. I mean, NFL football is just too exciting. We're going to just set all that other crap to the side right now. So we welcome an esteemed guest to our show right now, John Lopuch, joining us from Fanball.com. John, good to have you on the set.
It's great to be back, Jesse. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's absolutely a treat to have you here. We have John basically in to help the fantasy junkies out there break down the stretch run. As you know, John, we're entering money time in fantasy football land. Realistically, most league titles will be decided over the next 6 weeks, so now's money time.
It is. It's the most wonderful time of the year, I like to call it. I came up with that phrase right now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Just off the cuff.
Yeah, it's magnificent. I'm going to write a song about it.
I think there's probably a catchy tune in there somewhere.
I think there's something there.
Well, there's a lot to be dissected, and so we're going to jump right into it. But essentially, the idea behind this segment with John is to kind of talk about some players that you want to add to your fantasy roster over the next 2 or 3 weeks, because we know your trading deadline is probably approaching, and we know your fantasy playoffs likely going down in week 14, 15, and 16. So we just thought it would be a good idea to take a snapshot of the league as a whole and talk about some quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers that you need to add to your roster right now to help you dominate during the fantasy playoffs. Because, John, realistically, the team who's hot at the end takes home the money.
It's a lot like baseball. It's not always the best team. It's the hottest team at the end. So definitely looking forward to the next couple weeks. If you need a quarterback, short term, if you need to get into the fantasy playoffs, Ben Roethlisberger is your guy. He gets the Jets, Dolphins, and Bengals coming up in the next 3 weeks. Schedule gets a little bit tougher off that, but if you're worried about getting into the fantasy playoffs, Ben Roethlisberger is your guy. If you're confident you're getting to the fantasy playoffs, nobody's better than Carson Palmer. Not only is he an elite talent, not only is he getting Chris Henry back, he plays the Rams, the 49ers, and the Browns in the weeks 14, 15, and 16. If your fantasy playoffs are over those 3 weeks, there's absolutely no quarterback that has better matchups than Carson Palmer. Like I said, gets Chris Henry back. We already know he's a top 5 guy, top 3 in a lot of people's eyes. Carson Palmer's the guy to get if you know you're going to be in the playoffs.
Yeah, the only way Carson Palmer would be any better during that fantasy playoff stretch would be if he were able to somehow shift around and face his own secondary, because I mean the Bengals are pretty abhorrent on defense. So John's throwing out some names there at quarterback. You know, I look across the landscape of the league, and one of the guys that's really has really caught fire here in the last month and a half, Derek Anderson, Cleveland Browns. I was really surprised last week. John throws 3 touchdowns. His yardage total was a little lackluster, but still 3 passing touchdowns against Pittsburgh.
He's another guy that would benefit from playing his own secondary every week. Although it is important to note, with those poor defenses, guys like Palmer, guys like Anderson, what you get there is a lot of high-scoring games.
Right.
So you're going to need your quarterback to be throwing the ball a lot. It isn't going to be a lot of situations where in the fourth quarter they're running the ball a lot and your quarterback isn't producing at all. When you have guys like Anderson and Palmer, they're going to be throwing all game, and they're be getting you fantasy points all game.
Yeah, exactly. And another guy with some good matchups down the stretch at the quarterback position. He's a little old, but Kurt Warner, you're looking at his fantasy bowl stretch. Week 14, Cleveland. Week 15, the Saints. And week 16, Atlanta. That's some money time there for K-Dub. So some quarterbacks out there that you could probably add to your roster to help you. But moving from the quarterback position, John, fantasy owners know that championships are built on the back of running backs, and right now is a key time. There's guys out there you could potentially get to help you win your league. Give us some names at the running back position, guys that are going to finish really strong.
One guy that I really like to finish strong is Jamal Lewis. In Week 14, he gets the Jets. In Week 15, the Bills. In Week 16, the Bengals. Those are excellent matchups. The Bills are the toughest team that he's going to face. They're at best the middle-of-the-road fantasy run defense. So he's a guy, you're not going to get 4 touchdowns like you did a couple weeks ago. I'm not saying anything like that, but he's a guy that you can stick as your number 2 or number 3 running back and get a lot of production from. Another guy who just kind of won the job there, Ryan Grant. I'm sure he's been getting a lot of play in fantasy leagues. He's a guy that definitely look towards acquiring. If somebody in your league owns him and they're not real big believers, they just picked him up on a whim, if you can get him at a reasonable price, he's a guy that I would definitely target. He gets the Raiders, the Rams, and the Bears in those last 3 fantasy weeks. All three of those are bottom dozen teams. The Bears have given up 100-yard backs left and right. You know,
Right.
they have a reputation of a real good defense, but in fact, they're a defense that will give up a lot of yardage. Ryan Grant's a guy there. Another guy to target, and I don't think I'm breaking any new ground here, Steven Jackson. He's back. He's healthy. He finally finished a game last week. It had been since week 2 or week 3 since he finished a game healthy. He gets the Bengals, Packers, and Steelers. Packers and Steelers are pretty good defenses, as you know, Jesse.
Yep.
But the fact is, Steven Jackson's going to gain 100 total yards on just about anybody. And if the Rams score on the ground, and look at them, they're starting to play a little bit better, not even just the win. They've been scoring points in recent weeks. Steven Jackson's a guy that you can get. He's a top 5, top 7 guy that you can get at a top 15 price.
Yeah, exactly. And he's definitely added another move to his repertoire last week with a passing touchdown a la LaDainian Tomlinson.
Exactly. No, exactly. I think probably going to be the only one you get from him this year. I want to throw that out there. But you're right. They are using him in a lot of different ways. He's a guy, like I said, a lot of all-purpose yards. He's almost guaranteed to get you around 100 all-purpose yards every week, no matter who he's playing. As long as he stays healthy, he's a guy that's going to be in your lineup every single week.
And don't forget, guys, he finished really hot last season. As the season kind of closed out is when he really gained a lot of those touchdowns that made him that top 2,
and
top
his
3
offensive
pick.
line suffered a lot of injuries early in the season. Haven't had a lot of injuries recently. That means this unit, although they're not as talented as the original 5 he threw out there at the beginning of the season, they're starting to gel. Things can happen there.
Yeah, a couple other backs that I've been eyeing. One is a resurgent Warwick Dunn. Yeah, I'm talking about the old guy you probably forgot about.
What's with you and old guys?
Yeah. It's all about guys you could potentially pick up on the cheap, and stick into your lineup. A guy like Warwick Dunn. He's got he's got back-to-back 100-yard games, looked good last week, has made some plays, and in the fantasy stretch, I mean, he gets New Orleans in week 14. Tampa and Arizona are a little bit better teams, but, Warwick Dunn could help you get into the fantasy playoffs by playing St. Louis in week 13. So, Warwick Dunn is a player you might be able to acquire. If you're deep at wide receiver, you could maybe throw someone a cheap wide receiver. If you've got a hole at running back, maybe possibly plug it with Warwick Dunn. But a guy I really like, just based primarily because of his matchups for the rest of the way, Ernest Graham of the Tampa Bay Bucks. I mean, this guy kind of came out of nowhere after Cadillac Williams went down and Michael Pittman went down. Now Pittman's coming back. But and there's a little bit of worry there on the part of fantasy owners if that's going to filch a lot of Ernest Graham's action. But with matchups down the stretch of New Orleans, Houston, Atlanta, and San Francisco in Week 16, I personally see Ernest Graham doing some damage for fantasy owners.
Pittman, I think it's a situation where he's going to take a lot of what Graham had in the passing game.
Right.
But that still leaves all the rushing yards for Graham and still a fair amount of passing yards. With that easy schedule, he's a decent bet, to be a guy that gets you 100 total yards, and he's still going to be the goal line back there, I think. So you're going to get touchdowns from Ernest Graham. You're not going to get as many all-purpose yards as you did before, but you're still going to get enough to make him an interesting, like you said, fantasy play, number 2, number 3 running back for the next couple weeks, next half dozen weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're just joining us right now, we're talking with John Lopuch from Fanball.com. John joining us on the set here, kind of giving you some nuggets, some pearls of wisdom, if you will, talking about the fantasy football playoffs because we know that is just around the corner. Talking about players that you can hunt down, and we're moving right now to the wide receiver portion of this segment. John, this has been a strange season for wide receivers. A lot of the big-name wide receivers have been producing at a higher level than some of the big-name running backs, and there are some lesser-known wide receivers that are starting to make a name for themselves. So as we look over the next 6 weeks, what are a couple names that jump out at you guys that could possibly explode and help bring home the title?
What a long, strange trip it's been for the wide receivers. A lot of those top 5 guys that were in the beginning of the year, Torrey Holt, Steve Smith, we talked about him off the air. Those type of situations now have evolved into where you can't start Steve Smith, a lot of weeks.
Yeah, Marvin Harrison, where are you?
Marvin Harrison, where have you been? One guy that I think you should target, though, is Lee Evans. He's notoriously a second-half guy. J.P. Losman's back under center. They seem to have a real good connection. Even if Trent Edwards goes back under center, though, he's a guy in Evans that I believe you should be targeting. They get Miami, the Browns, and the Giants in weeks 14, 15, 16 in the fantasy playoffs. Like I said, with Evans, a notorious second-half guy. I think he's definitely somebody that fantasy owners should be targeting. Another guy, Deion Branch, averaging over 100 yards per game in the 3 games before he got hurt. He's coming back from that foot sprain. That Seattle passing attack is going to be much more potent than people remember because that running game's not there anymore. So they're going to be passing a lot more than they have in the past. I think Deion Branch is going to reemerge as the #1 guy there. He's a guy that I would target very strongly in fantasy trades in the future.
Yeah, Deion Branch is a guy you can pick up for pennies on the dollar. He's missed probably 3 or 4 straight games. Also had their bye week. He's going to come back, be healthy. And like you say, I mean, Matt Hasselbeck's throwing the ball all over the field. So I love that. Another name to drop here, a guy you mentioned when you were talking about Carson Palmer, is Chris Henry. Okay, now Chris Henry, we all know him as the smooth criminal, the guy that he beats up people in the parking lot and steals purses from old ladies and whatnot. But when this guy's in the lineup, you can't doubt his clout. He makes plays, John, and down the stretch, week 14, 15, and 16, St. Louis, Frisco, and Cleveland.
Yeah, exactly. And here's a guy who, when he came into the draft out of West Virginia, was a first-round pick on talent, ended up in the 3rd round because of his character issues. Looks like that's come to fruition perfectly.
Right.
On the field, he is as good a #2 or #3 receiver as you'll find.
Certainly.
Off the field, he's a menace. He mugged me on the way in. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. But like you said, he's served his suspension. He's going to be in there. The best part with Chris Henry, he's going to be matched up on 3, 4th, 5th string cornerbacks.
Right.
Against Baltimore, their top 2 cornerbacks were out. And so that put their 5th string cornerback on Chris Henry. In his first game back, 6 catches for 99 yards.
Right.
That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mentioned how poor that schedule is for the Bengals, or how great it is for the Bengals, how poor the defenses they're playing are. I think that's a great pick, Jesse. I think he's a guy that you should definitely pick up or even target in a trade if you need to.
Yeah, exactly. A couple other names I'll mention quickly here, based primarily upon matchups. We've talked about both of the quarterbacks that kind of go with these receivers, but Anquan Bolden, a player who's kind of been down a little bit lately as Larry Fitzgerald's been stealing more of that limelight. I could see a resurgence from Bolden here over the rest of the fantasy football season, as well as Hines Ward, a guy you mentioned, Ben Roethlisberger with the nice matchups. Hines Ward got back in the end zone last weekend, is a playmaker. I think that Pittsburgh might well be the 2nd best team in the AFC. I like both of those 2 plays down the stretch, and that's what it's all about, John, making money down the stretch.
Yeah, if you can get into the fantasy playoffs, you have to focus on these 3 weeks. If you know you're going into the fantasy playoffs, if you're, got 6 wins, 7 wins already, what you got to do right now is you got to make trades that set you up for weeks 14, 15, and 16. You'll thank us later. Don't worry about it. Send us some checks. We'll be all right that way. The key is to plan for the future.
Exactly. So we're planning for the future right now. We hope you're planning for the future as well. In the future of our broadcast, we're going to invite Jeff back onto the set. John, can you hang around for a while?
Yeah, sure. No problem.
John's going to be back helping us break down.
I have no social life. This is fine. This is great.
John's going to be back, help us break down some more of the matchups, helping you dominate your fantasy football league. That's what it's all about here on Testosterone, and we'll be back right after this.